I'd like to introduce our speaker today. It's Dr. Damaris Aschwanden, who's a postdoctoral researcher in the College of Medicine here at Florida State University. She received her Ph.D. in psychology in 2018 from the University of Zurich, Switzerland. During the work on her doctorate, she was also a fellow of the International Max Planck Research School on the Life course, which is a joint international PhD program that's shared between the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, the Freie Universität in Berlin, the Humboldt-University in Berlin, the University of Michigan, the University of Virginia, and the University of Zurich. Her research addresses associations between personality, health, cognitive aging, and dementia. And she investigates those links using data from a combination of different sources, particularly long-term care, longitudinal, and ambulatory assessment studies. And her recent work is focused on the evaluation of risk factors for dementia by applying machine learning and on the predictive value of cognitive performance and personality traits for daily cognitive behaviors. And so I won't take up any more of her time. Dr. Aschwanden, please go ahead.
Thank you very much for this nice introduction, Neil. And I will just go ahead and share my screen so that I can show you my presentation. Let me go in the presentation mode first. That makes things easier for me. And then here we are back. All right. So now you all should be able to see my slide, right?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. So welcome to my talk about personality and cognitive health in late life. As Neil already said, my name is Damaris Aschwanden, and I'm doing my postdoctoral research here at the College of Medicine. And the goal of my today's talk is to present you some recent research and what is going on in the literature on this topic of personality and cognitive health. So I am part of the, and I move this a little bit over here so you should be able to see it here. So I am part of the LPC Lifespan lab. I just want to shortly mention that. That is the Laboratory of Personality and Cognition across the Lifespan. And you should see some familiar faces on the right-hand side of this slide. So Dr. Angelina Sutton, Dr. Terracciano, and Dr. Lucchetti are also members of the ICL. And the research focus of our lab is the investigation of the association of psychosocial factors such as personality, purpose in life, loneliness with physical and mental health outcomes across the lifespan. And I just want to briefly mention our ongoing research project. We have a research project going on couples, and so I just use this opportunity, I hope you forgive me, to make advertisement in our own research group's interest. We are still collecting data. We are recruiting couples between the age of 40 and 70 years old that are in a committed relationship for at least 1 year and must live together. So if you're interested to contribute to research, please feel free to reach out. You can see the phone number or the email, or you can just also type in the chat that you want more information, and I will reach out to you. But now, enough of that. Now I'll show you the outline of what I'm going to talk during the next 40 minutes. So first, I will give a brief general introduction on what is cognitive health, what is cognitive aging, just to make sure that we are all on the same page. I will, of course, present research on personality and cognitive health, But I want also to focus on our most recent work that we did, which was a meta-analysis on personality and dementia risk. And I will conclude with one take-home message, and then I will open up for questions and discussion. So what is cognitive health? Cognitive health is the ability to clearly think, learn, and remember, and it is, of course, a very important component of everyday functioning. We know for a long time that with increasing age, various cognitive abilities tend to decline. And this phenomena is also called cognitive aging in aging research. So we know that processing speeds, but also other abilities tend to decline with increasing age. And there are two broad categories. We have fluid cognitive abilities like processing speed or more mechanic abilities, and we have crystallized abilities. And there is actually a difference in age when they start to decline. So we know from past research that fluid abilities tend to decline earlier, actually in the early 30s, and the crystallized abilities such as verbal knowledge that you accumulate over the lifespan tend to decline later, so in the late 70s. And I brought two figures just to illustrate that finding. So here you can see we have the general ability score, and then there is age from birth to 100 years. And we can see that there is a kind of it starts here around 20 or the 30s. So it depends also on the study. But general fluid abilities tend to decline earlier in life. And this illustration shows you different verbal cognitive abilities. For example, here in the orange color, you can see perceptual speed, while you see verbal ability around here with this bluish color. We again have the age and the standardized score of this specific test. And this is just also to show that not every ability has the same amount of decline. So there are three prominent theories that try to explain this age-related cognitive decline. We have the speed hypothesis, the common cause hypothesis, and the de-differentiation hypothesis. And the speed hypothesis of Salthouse postulates that with age, processing speed declines, and when processing speed is low, relevant operations cannot be successfully executed because there is not enough time, and simultaneous processing is limited, which leads to cognitive impairments. The common cause postulates, or hypothesis postulates, that there is a common biologically based factor that causes age-related declines not only in cognition, but also in sensory and functional domains. And the de-differentiation hypothesis postulates that cognition differentiates from general unified ability, while from childhood to early maturity to specific abilities. And then the reverse phenomenon occurs, that from late maturity, so the 20, 30-year-old, it that differentiates back to a general unified ability in older age. These are the three prominent theories that are discussed in the cognitive aging literature. But no matter which theory is right, or there might also be a combination of it, some degree of cognitive decline is typical of normal aging, and it will most likely happen to all of us, even the professors amongst us. And I made this remark to show you a little excursus of some work that we have done while I still was in Zurich during my PhD or during my grad school. So we compared the cognitive decline of retired professors with the cognitive decline of individuals with average education. So we had 47 retired professors. They had a mean age of almost 73 years, and they spent almost 21 years in education. The sample was clearly male-dominated, as you can see here. We compared their cognitive performance over 5 years with the cognitive performance of individuals with the average education. They were very comparable, almost identical in the mean age. Mean education was about 7 to 8 years less, and the sample was more equally distributed in terms of gender. So what did we find? We, as I said, looked at cognitive performance in processing speed at one time point and 5 years later, and then we calculated the cognitive decline score. And we found that processing speed declined in both groups over 5 years, and the decline was comparable. What was actually is more interesting is that individuals with average education who reported high levels of intel engagement were able to keep up with the average processing speed performance of the retired professors at baseline and the follow-up. So what that means when I say intellectual engagement is that individuals with average education that like to read, that like to discuss political topics, that are just curious and use computers and so on, those were able to keep up with the same performance as the retired professors. Okay. Coming back to cognitive decline, I said that some degree of cognitive decline is normal, but when it becomes so severe that it impacts daily living, then it's pathological and can be dementia. So dementia is an umbrella term. It's not a specific disease, and it refers to a group of cognitive and social symptoms that interfere with a person's ability to perform everyday activities. I know that a lot of you who are here do dementia research, but I just want to make sure that we are all on the same page. That's why I incorporated one slide on the definition of dementia. So as I said, there are different types of dementia. There is, for example, the Alzheimer's disease. It's the most common type. It accounts for 60 to 80% of dementia cases, but there are also other types, such as the Lewy body dementia, or the frontotemporal dementia, or the vascular dementia. Worldwide, there are currently living about 50 million people with dementia, and in the US, there were 5.8 million people aged 65 or older that lived with dementia in 2020. So that is about 1 in 10 people. Okay, so cognitive decline is neither linear, nor is it consistent or strongly related to chronological age. That means while some 75-year-olds may enjoy good cognitive functioning, others might be frail and be dependent on support from others to meet their daily or basic needs. So there is inter-individual variability in cognitive decline. And this is exactly what you can see on this figure. We have executive functions just as an example for a cognitive ability and age over here. And here, even when there is inter-individual variability across the lifespan, but since we are focusing on older age, If you look here, this is one person, and these are the cognitive or the executive functions of this person. And you can see there is no steep decline, right? But over here, there is another person that shows some very steep decline. So this is just to illustrate what inter-individual variability means. So this, of course, prompts then the question, why do some older adults maintain or even improve their cognitive functioning, while others show cognitive decline or develop cognitive impairment? And cognitive aging is influenced by many factors. These range from genetic, such as the E allele of the apolipoprotein E, from environmental, such as exposure to pollution, to behavioral factors like physical activity, or psychosocial factors such as personality or social network, and socioeconomic factors such as education. And in today's talk, obviously, I'm going to talk or focus on personality. Personality refers to individual differences in general patterns of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And personality can be characterized in a 5-factor model, also known as the 5-factor model or Big Five. And these 5 traits include neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, and conscientiousness. Neuroticism refers to the tendency to experience negative emotions such as anxiety or depression and having difficulties with impulse control. Extroversion refers to the tendency to be sociable, energetic, and excitement seeking. Openness refers to the tendency to be creative and to prefer variability or variety. So, for example, individuals who are high on openness tend to like trying different foods from different cultures or different cuisines. Agreeableness or people who are high on agreeableness tend to be trusting and altruistic and maybe reflect the stereotype of being a good friend. And individuals who are high on conscientiousness tend to be very organized and disciplined and plan ahead. So now you might wonder, why is this relevant? So why is it important to understand the relationship between personality and cognitive health? Well, specific personality traits may help older adults to maintain their cognitive functioning, or they could also serve as a source of vulnerability for cognitive decline and impairment. So recent research has shown that high school personality, so personality at a relatively young age, is linked with both cognitive function 30 years later, but also dementia risk 55 years later. And when we know which personality trait is associated with cognition or dementia risk, this could provide guidance to develop specific interventions, such as personality interventions depending on cognitive characteristics or cognitive interventions for different personality types. So this was a broad introduction into cognitive aging and defining personality. And now I'm going to show you an overview of whether personality is related to cognitive health. So there are different cognitive health outcomes. We have, for example, performance, that is cognitive performance at one point in time. Then cognitive decline, that is at least over 2 time points. And then we have the risk for impairment. And in the last few years, personality has increased interest or got increased attention in the association with cognitive health outcomes, which resulted in one review and at least 2 meta-analyses on cognitive decline and risk for impairment. And I'm going to present you the findings from these summary literature work rather than from single studies. So what do we know? We know that people who are high on neuroticism tend to show poorer performance on cognitive tasks. They tend to have a faster and steeper decline, and they are at the increased risk for cognitive impairment. For extroversion, the evidence suggests that people who are high on extroversion are better on speed-based tasks, but worse on reasoning-based tasks, while there is no clear evidence for cognitive decline or risk for impairment. Individuals who are high on openness tend to show better cognitive performance, while again, there is no clear evidence concerning the decline and the risk for impairment. For agreeableness, there is no clear evidence regarding performance decline or risk for impairment. And for conscientiousness, the findings are mixed when it comes to performance. However, when it comes to decline and risk for impairment, there is a more clear pattern, and that suggests that individuals with higher conscientiousness show slower and smaller decline and are at a decreased risk to develop dementia. So of course, there are different hypotheses discussed in the literature that try to know why and how is personality or specific traits related to cognitive health in older age. And I'm just going to give you a short summary for openness, neuroticism, and conscientiousness, because these are the 3 traits that are most consistently related to cognitive performance or cognitive decline and risk for impairment. And when I talk later about personality and dementia risk, I will also focus again on some models that are proposed in the literature on explaining these relations. But now, what do we know about openness and cognitive functioning? So the hypothesis is that individuals who are high on openness tend to engage more often in stimulating activities such as reading or doing crossword puzzles, which might contribute to cognitive reserve and result in better cognitive performance in older age. There is a hypothesis that proposes causation in the opposite direction, and it postulates that better preserved abilities also make it more likely that people show less decline. Because there is one study of Williams and colleagues, and they showed that executive functions, they are responsible for planning, organizing, declined in older age. And it could be that then when you are less well in planning, you don't like to confront yourself with novel situations. You prefer familiarity, what you know, and this might actually also cause some declines in openness because you are less willing to go outside and try new things. So that is one hypothesis that was discussed for the opposite causation for openness. For neuroticism, people who are higher on neuroticism, they tend to report more anxiety and stress, which actually could impair their cognitive functioning, not only in a test situation in the lab, but also in general when it comes to cognitive decline. The opposite hypothesis, or in the other direction, suggests that cognitive decline might actually also cause more anxiety, and worry about the future, about independency and so on. And this in turn could result in higher neuroticism scores. And for conscientiousness, people who are high on conscientiousness tend to engage in health behaviors such as eating healthy foods, doing physical activity, which in turn might be protective against age-related changes in the brain. Or also simply with better cognitive levels, it's easier to maintain previous levels of conscientiousness. Okay, I would like to focus now on the meta-analysis on personality and dementia risk. So this work was published earlier this year in the Aging Research Reviews. And we did 5 separate meta-analyses with 8 to 12 samples. So that means for every personality trait, we did a meta-analysis. And just that everyone is knows what a meta-analysis is. So a meta-analysis is basically a summary estimate of different studies or similar studies. You pull the data and then you're able to make an aggregated conclusion. Yeah, so we first looked or searched the literature for articles on personality and dementia risk. And then we screened these records, which were over 1,700, and we accessed them for eligibility, and that resulted in 12 articles at maximum for neuroticism that we could use. And then we conducted the meta-analysis. I'm not going into details of the statistics, but I'm happy to answer any questions on that at the end in the question section. And we controlled for age, gender, education, race, ethnicity, and depressive symptoms in our analysis. I'm just going straight to the findings. What did we find? Here you can see a so-called forest plot for neuroticism. You can see that the single studies, they are listed here, and then the individual results. But what we are interested in here is the aggregated result, which means that higher neuroticism was associated with an increased dementia risk. Then for conscientiousness, you can again see the single studies, but as I said, we are interested in the aggregated estimate, and we found that higher conscientiousness was associated with a decreased dementia risk. So we also found that lower extroversion, lower openness, and lower agreeableness were associated with an increased risk for dementia. But these associations were less robust and not significant in fully adjusted models. So that means that they were not significant anymore when we controlled for depressive symptoms, for example. And in terms of robust associations, that's what I'm going to talk next, because I said that we found consistent associations for higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness. And these associations were consistent across different dementia assessments. So what does that mean? That means it didn't matter whether these single studies assessed dementia using a cutoff score of cognitive performance, or whether they used a clinical diagnosis to assess dementia. It also did not matter whether the studies investigated this association more or less than 10 years. So the follow-up length did not moderate these associations. Also, it didn't depend on the publication year, so it didn't matter whether the study was published 20 years ago or 2 years ago. And it didn't matter which personality questionnaire was used to assess personality. the association were also consistent across the age of the sample, so the mean age of the sample, whether that was below or over 65 years did not affect the association, neither did the proportion of minority or the country. And for country, we just looked at whether there were different associations for the US and other countries, and we only had data from high-income countries such as Europe or Australia, and we did not have any data for low-income countries. But yeah, it didn't matter between high-income countries, let's put it that way. And also, it did not matter depending on the dementia type. But we only, because of the data, we were only able to compare the Alzheimer's disease and general dementia. We were not able to further differentiate between different dementia types. But in another study of our group, using a large data set of the UK Biobank that included over 400,000 participants, we found that neuroticism predicts risk for Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia, but not for frontotemporal dementia. And this is a very interesting finding, but of course, we also need to do further research, and we need to have data that actually differentiates between dementia types to investigate whether personality traits are differentially associated with different types of dementia. So having that said, that is one of the key strengths of a meta-analysis is to make more robust conclusions, also with testing these meta-regressions that I just explained to you, that it didn't vary between all these factors. So the conclusion is that we found consistent associations between lower conscientiousness and a higher neuroticism and the increased risk for dementia. Now the question is, of course, well, okay, so these associations are here. Well, what are the mechanisms? So how does this work? And there are 4 models discussed in the literature. Susan Segerstrom published a review article 3 years ago, where she proposes the common cause model. So that could be that personality is associated with dementia risk through a common gene. The spectrum model, which would assume that personality is reflecting an early symptom. The pathoplastic model, which means that personality would contribute to resilience, to neuropathology, or the predisposition model, which claims that personality is associated to dementia risk through health behaviors. And what Susan Segerstrom summarizes in her review is basically that the common cause model proposes that genes affect, or the genes that affect the personality phenotype also affect dementia risk. Current evidence, however, suggests that these effects are relatively small and unlikely to play a major role in the game. Then the spectrum model suggests that personality is a prodrome or other subclinical symptom of dementia. We know that after the onset of dementia, it is very common to observe personality changes, but personality does not appear to be a symptom before the onset of cognitive impairment. So also from our group, there is research suggesting that personality changes are not significantly different between individuals who develop dementia and those who did not develop dementia. There was a study conducted in 2017. And also, I showed you earlier that Chapman and colleague found that high school personality, which is a stage that is presumably free of dementia-related neuropathology, predicted dementia risk 54 years later. So although this model seems to be less likely, there needs to be further research on the temporal evolution of personality change across the different phases of dementia. Then the pathoplastic model suggests that personality influences the presentation or course of dementia, such as personality may contribute to resilience against neuropathology, for example, the amyloid plaque or the tau protein tangles, and therefore it allows to bear more of these before individuals actually experience symptoms. And also from our group, there is a recent meta-analysis, including 8 to 12 studies that is just in press now, and found that higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness were associated with more amyloid deposition and tau pathology. So the traits that are associated with dementia risks themselves are also related to the neuropathology, and therefore it could also be that personality traits may confer resistance to neuropathology. And then the last model, that is the predisposition model. There is a large amount of studies showing that higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness are associated with a worse health profile, physical inactivity, obesity, smoking, depression, and lower education. And all these factors are also associated with an increased risk for dementia. So which model is it now, right? That is the question that everyone wonders about, but there needs to be more knowledge, or we need more knowledge about the amount of neuropathological burden to differentiate between the two models. If personality is linked to better cognition despite burden, the pathoplastic model could be favored. But if personality is related to reduced burden, the predisposition model could be favored. And there is some evidence for the pathoplastic effect for neuroticism and some evidence for the predisposition model for conscientiousness. However, as I said, we need more studies on the neuropathological burden. But although the mechanisms are not yet fully understood, what are the potential implications from what we know? So our findings show that individuals with higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness have an almost 25% increased risk of developing dementia. This is based on the meta-analysis. And these effect sizes, so this 25% is comparable with those of other well-known and well-studied health and behavioral factors, such as diabetes, physical activity, or smoking. I have illustrated the effect sizes here in this table. You can see this is the result from our meta-analysis. And here I plotted the risk for diabetes, physical activity, and smoking from meta-analysis that were conducted by other researchers. And what this clearly shows is that diabetes increases the risk of dementia by about 18%. Physical inactivity increases the risk of dementia about 14%, and for smoking it's about 30%. But what this shows is that personality and at least neuroticism and conscientiousness are comparable in the effect size of these other factors, which underlines the importance of personality and indicates that personality should be considered when identifying at-risk individuals. So using web-based questionnaires, it could be possible to inexpensively screen people in the community for higher neuroticism and lower conscientiousness, and identify those with scores, with these scores, because these individuals would benefit most from inclusion into early interventions. But of course, the development of innovative personality-tailored interventions is now necessary to move the field forward and test whether individuals high on neuroticism and low on conscientiousness actually respond well to such interventions. But recent research indicates that it might be possible to change personality traits such as maladaptive aspects of neuroticism. And if such changes are enduring, interventions that target personality could be incorporated into dementia prevention and finally into the clinical context. So just to illustrate that, this is the study setup of a colleague, Seger and al., which they developed a personality intervention through the mobile phone. And they were able to show that individuals, and this is very important, individuals who are willing to change their personality actually were able to change their personality. But again, these changes need to be long-lasting before they could be incorporated into dementia prevention. Okay, now I would like to present you my take-home message, or at least I hope you learned something new, or at least got updated about the literature on personality and cognitive health. I think we can say that who we are shapes, at least to some degree, how we cognitively age, because we found robust evidence that lower neuroticism and higher conscientiousness are consistent predictors of good cognitive health in late life. And although the mechanisms are not yet fully understood and need to be further and are currently also investigated, I think it doesn't harm if we keep the recommendations in mind that are also recommended by the National Institute of Aging, how to keep good cognitive health, which you can see here. Keep your mind active, stay connected with social activities, be physically active, eat healthy foods, manage stress, pursue a purpose in life, and so on. With that, I would like to conclude my presentation, and I thank you for your attention, and I would like to open up for any questions or discussion.
Thank you very much. We'll open it up for questions now. If anybody has any questions, you can put them in the chat, or potentially unmute yourself, and we can get started that way. I don't see any yet in the chat. Why don't I get things started off a little bit? I was curious because there are some of the mechanisms underlying changes in different aspects of cognition. We're now starting to get an idea of how the brain is changing. Do we know anything about how the brain is organized that results in higher levels of conscientiousness? In other words, are there personality centers, so to speak, in the brain?
That is a very good question, and actually, I don't know. I'm sure there is some research on also like especially the neuroscience on like how for example different personality traits are associated with different brain structures. And with the knowledge I have, I would probably hypothesize that you could say that individuals who are high on conscientiousness might maybe have a neuronal network in the executive function in the frontal part of the brain. So that would be one of my hypotheses, and also maybe that people who are higher on neuroticism, a more dense amygdala, or the brain structures around the amygdala that is different from those people who are lower on neuroticism.
Thank you. I noticed something in chat. This is from Betsy. Does the increase in cognitive decline, I'll just get that back, means smoking at any time or current smoking? In other words, is smoking a risk factor for cognitive decline?
So this is a very good question, and that is also, to my knowledge, it is a very a hot topic in the smoking literature, but I'm not so familiar with the smoking literature. But anyways, it is usually a big deal to differentiate between whether people have ever smoked in their life or whether they currently smoke. And then also like how much or how many cigarettes for how many years and so on. And I'm blanking. I don't know what I think the meta-analysis that I showed you that looked at both smoking variables and current smoking and ever smoker. Usually the feeling I get from the literature that it is difficult to differentiate, and it doesn't matter so much whether you are currently smoking or whether you used to smoke for many years back in the past. But I would have to look that up. And also I'm not an expert on smoking.
Okay, a couple of other questions came in, or comments and questions. So Alice asked, clinically, caregivers consistently describe that someone's personality has changed due to their dementia. And it is in some ways actually part of the diagnosis, for instance, inability to do complex frontal lobe activities, such as work or finances or driving. So if conscientiousness changes, how can it be a predictor?
Yeah, so this is the what we call reverse causation problem. So it is still unclear whether conscientious or personality traits are a predictor only, or whether they are a clinical symptom. As I said, and as I presented, it looks rather that it is a risk factor independent of dementia, because also if you look at personality at high school, that is presumably free of neuropathology of dementia. So it's basically the health behaviors, or for conscientiousness, at least we would hypothesize that it's the health behaviors that also accumulate over the life course, and then that's why conscientiousness is considered as a risk factor, while later still after the onset of dementia you observe these changes in personality. Did I answer your question, or were you wondering about something more specific?
No, it's just an issue of premorbid personality, I guess, and at what point you don't consider them to be premorbid anymore.
Right. Okay.
And that is all. Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
High school would be good enough, but I don't know that many of us have high school measures of personality.
Yeah.
And since dementia is thought to have onset at least 10 years before the clinical diagnosis, then where along the spectrum do you consider their premorbid personality to be X versus what's actually happened to it as a result of dementia?
Yeah, that is a very good point, and it is difficult to get studies that have investigated personality for such a long time. So I think that the high school personality is clearly a unique study. But what we usually do, if we have studies, and that we do have studies that assess personality and cognitive performance over 20 years with the HRS, for example, and we always do a follow-up analysis, or sometimes at least, where we also exclude these participants who developed cognitive impairments 2 years or 4 years or 6 years before, and then we check whether the results are different or not, and that is at least the indicator that the results for personality are robust. If the results do not differ, of course, when these individuals are excluded.
Thanks. And a second question here was, with the prevalence of mixed dementia, it seems like it would be difficult to sort out personality changes by type of dementia risk. For instance, Alzheimer's versus vascular, when it seems that they often co-occur.
Yes, indeed. So it really just starts also with getting the data, and then differentiating between the types, or like having the data of the different types, and then also the changes. It is difficult.
Thanks. We have a little time for additional questions. Please put them in the chat, or if you'd like, unmute yourself, and then you can generate another one. Actually, I was just thinking about the personality in high school, how you could get that information. Maybe somebody should try going back and look at what people write in people's yearbooks. And I bet you could probably get rough indices of at least maybe 1 or 2 personality traits that way. And of course, for conscientiousness, just look at the grades. That's usually conscientiousness is positively related to academic performance.
Yeah, that is a very good point, actually. That could be an approach, that you look at the indirect indicators of associated with personality.
But
Okay,
you know, I don't feel like I'm the same as I was in high school. But then again, I could already be in my dementia prodrome. So
it's hard for you to check back.
Neil, this is Pat Hogan. I have one question. You summarized the interventions, a half dozen pretty well-known interventions. Are there studies that ascribe weight to those interventions, which are far more important than others?
Sorry, can you what kind of studies are far more important than others?
I was asking about intervention studies for trying to change cognition, and whether or not there are, for instance, meta-analyses that can tell you or let you know how you should be weighting them to decide what's effective and what's not.
Correct.
Well, so I'm not very familiar with the cognitive intervention literature, but as far as I remember from my PhD and from my grad school, there were a lot of cognitive interventions on the topic, and I'm sure there must be some meta-analysis on that. Although I don't know, there are very few studies that looked at it in association with personality. So I know that there's one study, there was a group in Switzerland, in Bern, and they did a working memory training, and they found out that people who are low on neuroticism responded better when it was a dual task rather than a trial task. So yeah, just in terms of personality and cognitive interventions, that is what I know from these kind of literature.
Yeah, and some of the studies that we run here have run here at Florida State University out of Wally Booth's lab and my lab, we occasionally get weak correlations with not strong, but fast measures of personality, like the TIPI. But but it's not a strong predictor, for instance, of how well people or their degree of gain or lack of gain on an intervention. We do have another question here from Charles Conaway, and he asks, are you still recruiting individuals and or couples for your current studies of cognitive decline? And then the second part was, can individuals only be acceptable or only couples?
Unfortunately not. So yes, we do still recruit, but we need the couple. So both members of the couple need to agree and participate in the study.
Let me again thank you, Dr. Aschwanden, for a very informative presentation today. Very much appreciated. Let's give her another round of applause. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to present our research. And yeah, thank you all for your attention.
And thanks so much from the audience for some very interesting questions.